Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? She sat in the back, hands folded, listening to the scrape of chairs and the hum of talk that filled the concrete-walled classroom at Fort Bragg. 13 men, all of them elite shooters from every corner of the special operations world, talked over each other, laughing, trading stories about wind calls and confirmed hits, about the kind of distances that made ordinary soldiers stare. No one spoke to her. No one asked her name. That was fine. She didn't need them to. Staff Sergeant Ashlin Merrick had learned early in her career that silence carried more weight than most words. It was the silence before a trigger pull, the silence before someone decided whether to doubt you or believe you. She knew how to live inside it. But still, sitting there, surrounded by men who barely looked her way, there was something in her that tightened, something that whispered that familiar sentence she'd been fighting since the first day of sniper school. You don't belong here. The instructor at the front of the room was a Navy SEAL chief with the kind of presence that filled space. He was explaining the rules for the final challenge of the Special Operations Advanced Marksmanship course. The tone in his voice was sharp, cutting through the buzz of conversation. One shot, he said. No sighters, 2,200 meters. Winds unpredictable. You miss, you're done. You hit, you walk away knowing you did what most people call impossible. The room quieted, a few smirks, someone whistled. Ashlin's eyes drifted to the map on the wall, a desert valley drawn in contour lines and pale ink. She imagined the terrain already, the way the sun would turn the air into waves of glass, the way heat would bend the light and twist a shooter's perception until even experienced marksmen began second-guessing themselves. She'd seen that kind of air before. The SEAL instructor continued, "We'll run the order by current standings. Top score shoots first, then down the list. You get one chance, gentlemen." He paused, his eyes flicked briefly toward the back row, the faintest change in tone. "And ladies." A few chuckles rippled through the room. Ashlin didn't move, didn't react. She'd heard that tone before too, the one that carried skepticism wrapped in politeness. Outside, North Carolina's summer heat pressed down heavy. Inside, the room smelled faintly of gun oil and coffee. It was the last day of the competition, 3 days of endurance, stress drills and tests that had stripped away everything except precision and will. 13 shooters had already missed that same impossible target over the past years. Nobody had hit it on a first attempt. But that wasn't what lingered in Ashlin's mind. It was her grandfather's voice. She could almost hear him, gravel and warmth mixed together. "The wind doesn't lie, kid. People do, computers do, but not the wind. You learn to see it, not read it." He taught her that before she even understood algebra. Out on a stretch of Montana plain where sky went on forever, he'd set up metal plates at distances that seemed absurd for a girl too small to hold a rifle without a sandbag. But she'd watched him shoot, watched him lie in the dirt, patient, eyes soft and unhurried as he studied the invisible lines of air that moved across the land. He had been a Marine sniper in Vietnam, a man who rarely spoke about war but spoke endlessly about respect. Respect for the weapon, respect for the shot, respect for the space between. Now, years later, she sat among men who measured their confidence in loud voices and ego, and she wondered what he would have thought of this room. The SEAL's voice broke her thoughts. "Questions?" No one raised a hand. He nodded toward the door. "Range brief at 600, get some rest, you'll need it." Chairs scraped, boots scuffed, conversations resumed, filling the air with that restless, competitive energy soldiers carried when there was something to prove. Ashlin stayed seated until most of them were gone. Then she stood, slung her pack over her shoulder and walked out into the night air. The humidity hit like a wall. The moon was low, the sky the color of burnt steel. She could hear crickets in the trees and the distant clank of a flagpole rope in the wind. She walked toward the barracks, past the dimly lit motor pool, her boots echoing on the asphalt. The quiet felt like a companion. In her room, she opened her rifle case with the same care most people reserved for opening letters from home. The metal gleamed softly in the lamplight. The weapon wasn't new. It wasn't factory issued. It was hand-built by her grandfather, a .338 Lapua Magnum with a Nightforce scope, and a stock that had felt like an extension of her shoulder since the day he'd given it to her. She ran a hand along the barrel. There were faint scratches near the fore-end, scars from Afghanistan, from the rocks outside Sangin where she had once lain still for 4 hours waiting for a target to appear. That memory carried a taste, dust and adrenaline, and something that felt like guilt. Her unit had made it back, but not everyone. She never forgot the sound of the radio that night, the clipped voice calling for medevac, the silence afterward. Sometimes late, she could still hear it. Ashlin opened her laptop. Numbers filled the screen, ballistic data, wind charts, atmospheric density tables. The software calculated solutions, but none of them felt right. She stared at the graphs until they blurred. The numbers couldn't feel the air, couldn't see it. She closed the laptop and sat back in the dim room. Her reflection stared back from the window, a woman who looked calm but carried the exhaustion of someone who'd spent too long proving herself. "You don't belong here." The thought came again, uninvited, sharp. She exhaled slowly. "You've said that before," she murmured. "Didn't listen then, not listening now." The next morning, she was at the range before sunrise. The valley lay still under a blue-gray sky. Hills curved like waves frozen in motion, dotted with scrub and stone. At the far end, just a sliver in the distance, stood the steel target, a human silhouette so small it looked unreal. She lay prone behind her rifle, chin resting on her folded arms, watching the light change. The wind was quiet at first, then shifted, a low whisper that made the dry grass sway. She watched, waited, watched again. Her grandfather used to say the world always told you what it was doing if you shut up long enough to listen. By 700, the other shooters had started to arrive. Rangers, Marines, SEALs, Air Force operators. The best of the best. They joked with each other as they unpacked rifles, some glancing her way, most pretending not to notice her at all. When the firing began, the valley echoed with thunder. One by one, the shots rang out. The air cracked. Spotters called over radios. "Miss left 30 meters. Miss 40 low. Miss." Each miss made the silence that followed heavier. Ashlin stayed still, watching the dust plumes bloom across the far ridge. She saw how the heat distorted the air, how the wind shifted with every shot. Each miss told her something the shooters didn't seem to notice. The wind pattern wasn't constant. It bent halfway downrange, twisting in a direction the range anemometers couldn't sense. She felt her heartbeat slowing. She understood what was happening. The wind near the firing line was weaker. Farther down, it was violent, curling like river eddies. The bullets weren't drifting left by chance. They were being pushed by a current the computers couldn't calculate. She could see it, the faint shimmer above the valley floor, the way small dust spirals moved counter to the direction of the grass. The sign was there if you knew where to look. By the time the 12th shooter had missed, frustration hung thick in the air. The SEAL instructor, Chief Vickers, stood with arms folded, shaking his head. His voice carried across the line. "Any snipers want to try?" He didn't mean it as an invitation. He meant it as an ending. Ashlin stood. The laughter that followed was low but audible. A few men smirked. One muttered something about checking a box. She walked forward anyway, step by step, deliberate, calm. She knelt beside her rifle case and opened it. The metal caught the morning light. The world went quiet. Her hands moved with ritual precision. Bolt, magazine, bipod, scope, cap. The motion was muscle memory, clean and unhurried. When she lay down behind the rifle, the valley seemed to exhale. Chief Vickers crouched beside her, You sure about this? She didn't look at him. Her voice was steady. I wouldn't be here if I was. He hesitated. You've shot this far before. No, she said softly, but I've read farther. He frowned, puzzled. Read. She smiled faintly. The wind. He didn't respond, just stood backing away, radio in hand. Ashlin exhaled once, the kind of breath that steadies more than lungs, it steadies the soul. The valley shimmered in the heat. She ran through the data in her mind. Velocity, drag, drop. Then she ignored half of it. Instead, she watched the air itself, the language she had known since childhood. The mirage told her what no sensor could. Halfway downrange, the wind wasn't what it seemed. She adjusted her scope 3 clicks right, then 5, then 8. The whispers behind her grew louder. She kept going. 10, 11, 12, 13, then stopped. Her grandfather would have said it the same way. Trust what you can see. Ashlin pressed her cheek against the stock. The rifle felt like memory, warm, familiar, alive. She controlled her breathing, waited for her heartbeat to settle into the rhythm she'd trained for years. She thought about the voices that had doubted her, about every look that told her she didn't belong. She let it all become part of the silence. The crosshairs steadied, and she squeezed the trigger. The crack split the morning air, echoing across the valley like thunder rolling off stone. She didn't blink, didn't breathe. 3.5 seconds passed. Then the radio came alive with a single word. Hit. The valley erupted. For a moment, no one moved. The sound of the impact still hung in the air, faint but undeniable. The metallic ring of steel struck at impossible distance. It carried across the valley like an echo of disbelief. Then voices broke through. Radios crackled. Someone yelled, "Confirm impact." Another answered, "Center mass, clean hit." The range erupted in noise, cheers, laughter, disbelief, muttered curses. A few men stood staring through scopes that suddenly meant nothing. Others looked toward her, blinking like they needed to see with their own eyes that she was real. Ashlin didn't react. She stayed prone behind her rifle, cheek pressed to the stock, watching through the scope, though she couldn't see anything now. Only the shimmer of heat, the ghost of a target. Her finger still rested on the trigger, steady. She felt her pulse finally crash through the calm she'd forced upon it. The adrenaline came late, all at once, trembling through her hands, her shoulders, her breath. She blinked, and only then realized her vision had blurred from holding it so still. When she lifted her head, the first thing she saw was the instructor. Chief Vickers stood 20 feet away, binoculars hanging forgotten from his neck, mouth slightly open, expression caught between awe and confusion. He looked like a man trying to reconcile math with a miracle. He walked toward her slowly, as if approaching something delicate. "You," he paused, searching for words that didn't sound foolish. "You hit it." Ashlin sat up, unhurried. She opened the bolt, ejected the spent casing, caught it before it hit the ground. It was still warm. The brass gleamed against her palm. She looked at it for a moment, the simple proof of something extraordinary. Then she started breaking down her rifle. No smile, no show, just quiet precision. The noise around her was a wave. "Holy, did you see that?" "No way that's possible." "Check the radar log, man. That's a confirmed hit." But the words didn't reach her the way they reached the others. They bounced off the thin shell she'd built around herself, the same one she'd worn in combat, when noise was a distraction and composure was survival. When Vickers crouched beside her again, his voice had softened. "That's the longest confirmed hit we've ever had here, maybe anywhere under field conditions." He hesitated. "How did you know?" Ashlin looked up. Her eyes were calm again, the storm already settling. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "I listened." He frowned, uncertain. She continued, almost like she was speaking to herself. "Everyone else tried to shoot through the wind. I shot with it." It wasn't arrogance. It was observation, pure, unembellished truth. Vickers nodded slowly, as if filing that sentence away somewhere important. Behind them, the rest of the shooters were gathered near the firing line, watching her with a new kind of silence, not the dismissive quiet from before, but something heavier. Respect, maybe, or confusion. The kind that comes when the world shifts slightly and you realize your assumptions just broke in half. Ashlin finished packing up her rifle. When she stood, the sun caught the faint oil sheen on the barrel, gold against steel. Coltrane, the ranger who had shot first and missed wide, approached her. He was taller, older, the kind of man who looked carved from field experience. His voice was rough. "You just made us all look bad, Sergeant." She waited for the punchline, but then he offered his hand. "And I mean that in the best damn way possible." She shook it. His grip was strong, firm, the kind soldiers give when words aren't enough. "Good shot," he said simply. Ashlin nodded. "Good wind," she replied. He grinned. "Guess I didn't read it right." She looked back toward the valley. The air shimmered again, indifferent to human pride. "Most people don't," she murmured. Later, after the range had cleared and the noise had faded into heat and dust, she sat alone under the shade of the operations tent. The trophy, a polished piece of metal shaped like a bullet, sat on the table in front of her. It caught the light like a mirror. She didn't look at it much. It didn't mean what everyone thought it did. She thought about her grandfather instead, the way he used to sit with her in the barn at dusk, gun oil and sawdust in the air, explaining how every rifle carried its own language, how shooting wasn't about dominance but understanding. "You don't fight the wind, Ash," he'd said once, setting down a cleaning rod. "You listen, same as people. The ones who can't listen, they'll always miss." She'd been too young to understand the second part then. She understood it now. When the awards ceremony started that afternoon, she stood at the edge of the group. Her name was called last. Staff Sergeant Ashlin Merrick, overall winner, record holder, longest confirmed field hit at the Special Operations Advanced Marksmanship course. The applause was real, but the disbelief was louder. She walked forward, took the certificate, the small trophy, shook hands with the cadre. When she turned to step off the platform, she caught Vickers' eye. He gave a single nod, subtle, meaningful. Respect without show. It was the only acknowledgement that mattered. That evening she was back in her barracks, the quiet closing around her like a familiar blanket. The others had gone out drinking, celebrating, dissecting every inch of her shot as though analyzing it would make it less miraculous. She stayed behind. She sat on her bunk, rifle case beside her, the brass casing from that morning balanced in her palm. She turned it over and over, feeling its weight. The air conditioner hummed. The light outside shifted from gold to gray. For the first time that day, she let herself breathe out everything she'd held in, the tension, the doubt, the noise. Her hands trembled slightly, the kind of tremor that came not from weakness but from release. She whispered to herself, "You did it, Grandpa." The words hung in the stillness. But beneath them, another thought grew, one that wasn't pride, but something more complicated. Why did it matter so much to prove them wrong? That question followed her through the next days. Through the interviews, the handshakes, the offers to teach. Everyone wanted to talk about the distance, the record, the miracle. No one asked about the silence before the shot. No one asked what it cost to live every day waiting to justify your existence. She accepted the invitation to instruct at the advanced sniper course. It was supposed to be an honor to teach others what she knew. But when she arrived weeks later, the feeling that met her wasn't celebration. It was scrutiny. The same whispers. "She's the one who got lucky. Mirage must have lined up just right. Let's see if she can teach it." Ashlin said nothing. She learned a long time ago that silence made people uncomfortable in all the right ways. During her first class, she stood in front of 20 students, soldiers from across the branches, eyes sharp, arms crossed. She asked them a simple question. "What's the hardest part of a long-range shot?" Hands went up, answers came. Elevation adjustment. Bullet drop. Wind call. She nodded, then she said, "No, it's trust." Confused looks, a few raised brows. "Trust," she repeated. "In your read, in your process, in yourself. The bullet can't question you mid-flight, only you can." Someone in the back snorted quietly. She ignored it. "Anyone can learn the math," she continued. "But math can't feel the air, trust can." It took weeks, but slowly the skepticism started to fade. Her students began to see it, the way she could stand on a range, look across the terrain, and tell them exactly where their rounds would drift before they fired. Some called it instinct. Others called it art. Ashlin didn't call it anything. She just did the work. Still, late at night, she'd sit alone in the empty classroom after the day's lessons, staring at the wind diagrams on the wall, and wonder if her grandfather would have been proud or disappointed that she still needed to prove anything at all. The truth was, she didn't know why the shot mattered anymore. Maybe it wasn't about the record. Maybe it was about that small, defiant part of her that refused to be invisible. Maybe it was about all the times she'd been told she couldn't, and all the quiet moments when she did anyway. Outside, Fort Bragg's night air carried the faint rhythm of cadence calls, the echo of boots on pavement. Inside, her reflection stared back from the window, the face of someone who'd won something that didn't feel like victory yet. Sometimes, she thought, the hardest targets aren't made of steel, they're made of perception. And she wasn't done hitting those yet. Why did the classroom feel colder when everyone else left? Ashlin sat alone after the final lecture of the day, the smell of dry marker and gun oil still in the air. The students had gone, 20 men who'd entered her course with skepticism and now left it with quiet respect. Their targets were still pinned to the wall, holes clean through the center. Each one a small echo of the things she'd taught them about trust, patience, the art of stillness. But the room felt empty, too empty. She set down the marker, walked to the open door, and looked out over the range. Evening light stretched across the grass, long and gold. The valley wind whispered through the flags at the 300-meter line. She watched it move, the way it bent the world's surface in small, deliberate ripples. She'd spent years chasing that movement, learning to read it, predict it, live by it. But lately, she'd started to wonder if she'd also hidden inside it. Her phone buzzed against the desk. An email notification. Guest instructor request, Joint Allied Sniper Program, RAF Base Fairford. She stared at it for a long time. Another opportunity, another stage, another set of eyes waiting to see if the legend was real. She didn't feel like a legend. She still remembered Afghanistan, the silence after the shot, the way the radio static would crawl into her ears and stay there. She remembered the days when she'd hit everything she aimed at, but somehow couldn't shake the feeling that she was still missing something. That night she left the classroom lights on. 2 weeks later, England. Rain fell in sheets across the training range, a kind of cold that seeped into the bones. The students here were a mix of British, German, and Canadian operators. They were good, calm, efficient, and they watched her with a mix of curiosity and reserve. One of them, a tall corporal from the Royal Marines, asked during the first morning brief, "Ma'am, what's the secret to your wind calls? We read the same data and still end up off target." Ashlin smiled faintly. "Maybe you're reading too much," she said. He blinked, sorry. "Look," she continued, walking toward the open door. The rain had softened to mist. "Wind doesn't have one language, it's not data, it's story. You have to watch it, feel what it's trying to do to you." They followed her outside, skeptical but curious. She pointed to a nearby puddle, its surface rippling in uneven rings. "See that?" she asked. "The big ripples move east to west, the small ones move opposite, 2 layers. The bullet crosses both. One helps you, one hurts you, guess wrong and you chase ghosts." The corporal frowned. and you can tell which one's stronger. Ashlin nodded slowly. You can, if you listen long enough. It wasn't something she could teach in formulas. It was something learned in silence, in patience. That night, one of the instructors asked if she ever missed teaching in the U.S. She shook her head. I don't miss places, she said softly. I miss people. Anyone in particular? Her answer took a long time to form. My grandfather, she said finally. He taught me everything that still works. The man nodded. He must have been proud. She looked away. He didn't live long enough to see me stop missing. He didn't ask what she meant, and she didn't explain. When the course ended, the commander of the joint program shook her hand and told her she made a stronger impression than any instructor they'd brought before. Ashlin thanked him politely, but inside she felt nothing. On the flight home, she watched clouds drift beneath the aircraft's wing. The sky above was still and blue, the kind of vastness that used to bring her peace. But lately, the quiet stretched too far. It echoed in places inside her that she didn't want to admit were empty. She thought about her students, about how they looked at her not like a person, but a standard, a living test they'd all measure themselves against. She thought about how she'd once looked at her grandfather the same way. When the plane landed back in North Carolina, the humidity hit her like memory. Fort Bragg hadn't changed. Same concrete, same heat, same air thick with routine. She walked to her quarters, dropped her gear, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. A small brass plaque hung there, a copy of the one in her grandfather's shop. 2,200 meters, June 2014. She'd brought it with her when she started instructing. Back then, it had been a reminder. Now it felt like a weight. Because behind that number was the question no one ever asked. What happens after the impossible? No one tells you how quiet it gets when the world stops doubting you. It was late August when the request came. A letter stamped with the Department of Defense seal. She was being considered for a new assignment, a long-range reconnaissance tasking under Joint Special Operations Command. No combat requirement, they said, just advisory work. But the phrasing was careful, too careful. She knew what that meant. It wasn't advisory, it was selective, quiet work, the kind that didn't make press releases. She read the letter twice, folded it once, and left it on the table. That night she couldn't sleep. The hum of the base generators filled the air outside. Inside, the shadows from the ceiling fan spun in slow, restless circles. Part of her wanted to say yes, to feel the edge again, the focus of field work. Another part of her wanted to stay where things made sense, where the world was measured in distances and wind speeds, not decisions and casualties. She lay awake until dawn, thinking about Afghanistan. There had been a mission once, a village on the edge of Helmand. She made a shot there that saved her team. It was perfect. But afterward she'd learned the round had passed through a wall and the wall hadn't been empty. She hadn't pulled a trigger since, without hearing the echo of that mistake. It wasn't something the men talked about. Regret, guilt, the ghosts of the things you didn't mean to do, but she carried it the way she carried her rifle, quietly, always ready. Now the letter sat on her desk, waiting for an answer. At 600 she picked it up, signed the acceptance, and folded it back into the envelope. She didn't know why she did it. Maybe because peace felt too far away to wait for anymore. The operation was simple on paper. Observation post, remote desert, support for Allied ground teams. No one mentioned the politics, the volatility, the risk. They just told her what she needed to know, the coordinates, the equipment, the people she'd be working with. A small multinational team, communications specialist, medic, 2 forward observers, and 1 overwatch sniper. Sorry. When she arrived at the staging site, a forward base carved out of the desert, the first thing she noticed wasn't the heat. It was the sound. The silence between engine roars, the space where the world held its breath. She knew that silence. She trusted it. The team greeted her with polite professionalism. One of the men, the medic, young, nervous, asked if she was the same Ashlin Merrick who pulled off that 2,200-meter shot. She almost smiled. Depends who's asking. He laughed awkwardly, unsure if it was a joke. That night, under a sky so wide it made you feel small, she assembled her rifle again. Every screw, every bolt, deliberate. The stars above flickered like distant tracer rounds frozen mid-flight. She thought about her grandfather, about the barn, the smell of walnut and steel, the sound of his voice saying, "You'll never know the wind until you listen to it with your bones." She wondered if he'd known she'd end up here, a quiet place halfway across the world, about to stake her name and sanity on reading a wind no one else could feel. The desert whispered around her tent. Fine grains of dust slipped through the seams like secrets. She closed her eyes and listened. In the morning she woke before dawn. The horizon was a pale bruise of light. She carried her rifle to the high ridge overlooking the valley, their observation point. The others were still setting up comms, unpacking sensors, calibrating instruments. Ashlin lay flat on the coarse earth, scope trained on the far ridgeline. She watched the dust move. Not the big storms, not the visible gusts, but the small ones. The kind that told stories if you had the patience to listen. She felt the wind shift once, then twice. Northwest, then east. The two fought for dominance like opposing thoughts. She whispered under her breath, "Make up your mind." Behind her, the medic's voice came through the radio. "Command wants daily atmospheric reports every 6 hours." Ashlin keyed her mic. "Copy that. Tell them the wind's still lying." He laughed, not realizing she meant it. She adjusted her scope and stayed there long after everyone else rotated off. The desert heat rose. Her world shrank to the weight of the rifle, the breath in her chest, and the stories carried on invisible air. And somewhere beneath all of it, she felt the old question stirring again, the one she'd never really answered. "What are you still trying to prove, Ashlin?" She didn't know, not yet. But she suspected the wind would tell her when it was time. How long can someone stare through a scope before forgetting what they're looking for? 3 days. That's how long Ashlin had been on the ridge. The wind, the dust, the horizon, all of it had blended into one endless hum. The mission was supposed to be simple: overwatch, observation, silent support. Watch the valley, record what moved, report what shouldn't. But silence wasn't peace, it was pressure. And in the stillness, the mind starts to wander. She lay prone under a camouflage veil, her rifle steady, her breathing measured. Below, the desert stretched for miles, a pale ocean of rock and light. The Allied convoy was somewhere beyond the next ridgeline, hidden by distance and heat shimmer. Her scope tracked a patch of movement, a small dust trail too faint for vehicles, too erratic for wind. Someone was out there. "Command, this is Overwatch 1, she whispered into her mic. "I've got possible movement. Grid 942 by 716. Stand by for confirmation." Static crackled. Then the voice of the comms tech replied, "Copy that, Overwatch. Can you ID?" "Negative. Mirage is cutting resolution. Give me 30 seconds." She adjusted her focus, fine-tuning the parallax until the image steadied. The shape came into view, 2 figures, cloaked, moving slowly along the low dunes. Shepherds maybe, but their path was wrong, too straight, too cautious. Her pulse slowed even further. The world narrowed to a circle of glass in silence. "Command, those are not civilians." "Confirm, Overwatch." "Confirmed." A pause, then, "Engage if necessary." She hesitated. The shot was clean, her line of sight unobstructed. The distance, roughly 1,400 meters, well within her comfort range. But something tugged at her chest. The way the second figure moved, slower, smaller. Not tactical, not trained, maybe older, maybe not even armed. Ashlin steadied her breath. "Stand by," she said. The radio hissed, "Overwatch, what's your holdup?" She didn't answer immediately. She watched, eyes tracing every shift of fabric, every step. The smaller figure stumbled once, then again. The taller one reached out to steady them. Her finger eased off the trigger. "Negative fire," she said quietly, recommending continued observation. Static, then a terse reply. "That's against protocol. You have confirmed hostile movement." Ashlin's jaw tightened. "Not confirmed enough." Silence again. Then the voice changed, her field commander this time. "Merrick, we trust your call, but if you're wrong, it's on you." She almost smiled at that. It was always on her. She stayed on the scope another hour. The two figures eventually turned away, fading into the sand haze. She exhaled a slow breath, tension unwinding from her shoulders. Her spotter, a quiet Air Force lieutenant named Drake, handed her a canteen. "You just saved 2 lives," he said softly. "Or risked 6, she replied. Drake studied her. "You think too much for a sniper." Ashlin smiled faintly. "Maybe that's why I'm still one." That night the wind came hard. A desert storm, fast and mean. Sand whipped through the air like shrapnel, rattling the tents, screaming through the ridges. Ashlin sat awake, listening to the wind batter the world outside. Every gust sounded like memory, Afghanistan, Helmand, Sangin, places she'd left behind but never really escaped. She picked up her rifle, checking the bolt by feel. The weapon was more than steel and precision. It was memory forged into metal. Her grandfather's handprints still lived in the grain of the stock, in the tiny imperfections no machine could duplicate. When the wind finally died near dawn, she stepped outside. The world was washed clean, dunes smoothed, the horizon sharp again. Drake joined her, rubbing sand from his eyes. "Command says the Allied teams moving in today were to stay high and cover." She nodded. By midday, the convoy appeared, 6 vehicles crawling across the valley like dark insects. The radio filled with chatter, coordinates, bearings, warnings. Then it happened. The explosion bloomed without sound at first, just a sudden flash of orange and black, a bloom of dust and debris rising like a living thing. The sound hit half a second later, a thunderclap that punched the air from her lungs. "Impact, impact, Vehicle 3 is down," someone screamed through the comms. Ashlin was already moving, rifle up, scope searching, eyes cutting through chaos. Smoke poured from the wreckage below. Shadows moved, enemy combatants emerging from the ridges, muzzle flashes flickering like lightning. "Contact multiple hostiles south ridge," Drake shouted. "Range 600 meters. Wind variable 8 to 10 knots cross." She didn't need to think. Her body moved faster than thought. She dialed 2 clicks left, 1 up, sighted, fired. The first round hit center mass. The second hit before the body fell. The third tore through the next figure mid-stride. Drake's voice came again, calm but tight. "Good hits, they're falling back." Ashlin stayed on the trigger, scanning, calculating. The storm had stripped the valley bare, every movement visible. She saw muzzle flashes at 9 o'clock, another cluster at 1. The radio screamed with overlapping voices, chaos from the convoy, orders drowned in static. "Overwatch, we're pinned, need cover fire." "Copy," she said. Her tone was even, detached. The calm of someone who lived on edges where panic was a luxury. She fired again, felt the recoil kick into her shoulder like a heartbeat. Each shot clean, deliberate, surgical. Drake fed her data, wind, bearing, target shift, but she barely heard him. Her world had shrunk again to that perfect tunnel where everything existed and nothing mattered except the next breath, the next squeeze, the next wind read. When the dust finally settled, silence returned as suddenly as it had been shattered. The radio carried the words, "Convoy secure, hostiles neutralized." Ashlin exhaled slowly, lowered her rifle. Her hands were steady, her pulse was. Drake let out a long breath. You saved them all." She didn't answer. Her eyes stayed on the valley, on the burning wreckage. Because all she could see was what she'd almost done the day before. What might have happened if she hadn't trusted her hesitation? If she'd fired at the wrong shapes in the wrong wind? The difference between hero and murderer, she thought, was sometimes just a second's doubt. That evening, the sun fell red across the sand. The valley looked peaceful again, the kind of peace that only exists after noise. Ashlin sat on a crate near the edge of camp, rifle across her knees. Drake joined her, setting down 2 cups of instant coffee. "Command, calling it a success," he said. "Minimal casualties. You're a damn legend out here now." She took the coffee but didn't drink. "Legends are just people we forget are human," she murmured. He glanced at her. "You don't sound happy about it." She smiled faintly. "Happiness isn't part of the job." He studied her for a moment. "You ever think about what comes after?" Ashlin looked toward the horizon, the endless distance where sky met dust. "There's always another target," she said softly. "Different place, same noise." Drake didn't respond. He didn't need to. Later that night, she found herself staring at the stars again. The desert was quiet now, only the whisper of the wind brushing over the dunes. She thought about her grandfather. She wondered if he'd understand the things she carried now, the ghosts that came not from missing, but from hitting too well. In her head, she heard his voice again. "You can't fight the wind, Ash. You learn to work with it." She whispered back, "I'm trying, Grandpa, I really am." The stars didn't answer. But the wind did, a soft breath that brushed her cheek, almost like forgiveness. She closed her eyes. For the first time in days, she let herself cry, quietly, briefly, the kind of tears that never reach the ground. Because out here, everything you let go of just turned to dust. The next morning, she received a transmission from command. The operation was being extended. They'd identified a high-value target believed to be operating in the region, a tactician coordinating insurgent ambushes. Ashlin's new order was clear: observe and eliminate if opportunity presents. She read it twice, folded the paper and slipped it into her pocket. Drake caught her expression. "You okay?" She nodded. "Just another day." But it was. Something about this one felt heavier. Maybe it was the weight of the last few days. Maybe it was the creeping realization that even perfection couldn't keep you clean forever. She looked back at the valley, the same one she'd protected and nearly destroyed all in the span of a heartbeat. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice whispered not doubt but warning. "The next shot won't be clean." What if the wind warned you, and you fired anyway? Ashlin asked herself that question as dawn broke over the desert once again. Pale light bled into the horizon, and the world looked clean, untouched. But she knew better. The sand below her boots carried the memory of shrapnel, the echo of things that couldn't be seen. She lay prone on the ridge again, scope steady, breath calm. This time the mission felt different, colder, narrower. "Target expected in Sector Bravo 1, came command's voice over the radio. "Convoy of 3 vehicles. Estimated arrival 8:30. You have engagement authority once confirmed." She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound of the wind fill her ears instead. It wasn't constant. It shifted in waves, pulling dust and whispers across the rocks. It reminded her of her grandfather's voice, low and certain. "If the air feels wrong, it usually is." "Overwatch 1, do you copy?" She keyed her mic. "Copy, in position." Drake, her spotter, was beside her, glassing the valley through binoculars. His voice was calm but distant. 3 clicks out. Dust trail forming, could be them. Ashlin adjusted her scope, magnification tight. Heat shimmer danced like smoke across the valley. Then, slowly, shapes emerged, 3 vehicles, moving fast, engines leaving long wakes of dust behind. She sighted in, letting the reticle settle over the lead truck. Drake murmured, "They're not marked. Command wants confirmation." Ashlin studied the silhouettes. No flags, no insignias, but the movement, the rhythm of the convoy was organized, disciplined, military. "They're too tight," she said softly. "Insurgents don't run formation like that." Drake frowned. "You saying?" "Could be friendly," she finished quietly. "Command says otherwise. Command's 200 miles away." He didn't reply. He didn't have to. The radio crackled again. "Overwatch 1, confirm and engage. That's an order." Ashlin's finger rested on the trigger. Her heart didn't race, not yet. She had trained that out years ago. But her mind, her instincts, her bones, they all whispered something else. The air felt wrong. She zoomed in tighter. Through the shimmer, she caught something on the hood of the second vehicle, a faint glint. Not a weapon, not a threat. A badge, a patch. Her breath caught. It was an enemy. "Hold fire," she said firmly into the mic. "That's not hostile. Overwatch 1, you are ordered to engage." She hesitated. "Negative, friendly convoy, do not fire." Static filled her headset, then silence. Drake looked at her, waiting. "Ma'am." She exhaled. "We're not pulling that trigger." For a long moment, nothing moved. Then faintly, another voice came over the radio, not command, not her team. It was a woman, clear, professional, urgent. "This is Guardian Convoy, Alpha Team. Who the hell just painted us with a laser?" Ashlin felt her stomach drop. She keyed her mic again, voice steady. "Guardian Alpha, this is Overwatch 1. We had you listed as hostile. I held fire, you're clear." "Jesus," the voice breathed. "Copy that, you just saved 6 of us." The transmission cut. Ashlin set the rifle down and leaned back. For a few seconds, she just breathed. Drake exhaled beside her, long and shaky. "That was too damn close." "Yeah. Command not gonna like that." She almost smiled. "They'll get over it." But she knew better. By nightfall, the report came in terse, formal, distant. "Engagement order not followed. Command review pending." Ashlin folded the paper and tucked it into her vest pocket. She didn't need to read it twice. Drake found her cleaning her rifle under the canvas awning, the light from the lantern flickering across the metal. "They'll court-martial you for that," he said quietly. She looked up, expression unreadable. "Maybe. You saved friendlies." "Doesn't matter, I disobeyed." He hesitated, then sat beside her. "Why'd you do it?" She paused mid-motion, the cleaning rod still in her hand. "Because the wind was lying again," she said softly. He frowned. "The wind?" She smiled faintly. "The kind that comes from men sitting in offices with maps. They think it blows one way. It doesn't." He stared at her. "You think they'll make an example of you?" "I think they already have," she said. The investigation came fast, too fast. By the end of the week, she was pulled from the field and flown to the forward command base. The ride was silent. The air inside the helicopter smelled of fuel and dust. She stared out the window at the endless stretch of desert and thought about the shot she hadn't taken. The one that mattered more than all the ones she had. In the debriefing tent, a colonel with tired eyes and pressed creases in his uniform leaned across the table. "Sergeant Merrick, you were given a direct order to engage. You refused." "Yes, sir." "Your justification?" "The targets were friendly." "You had no way to confirm that." "I had eyes on. I saw their markings." "That's not confirmation under our protocol." She met his gaze steadily. "It was under mine." The colonel sighed. "You've built a reputation, Merrick. You know that. Everyone from Bragg to Bagram knows your name. But out here, reputation doesn't replace obedience." "I'm aware." "Then you understand what happens next." She nodded. "Yes, sir." He leaned back, studying her. "You saved lives, but you also disobeyed an order that, if it had been correct, might have cost us everything. Do you see the problem?" "I see the truth," she said quietly. The problem is pretending the two are the same thing. The colonel's jaw tightened. For a second he looked almost impressed. Then he stood. You'll be reassigned pending review. Dismissed. She stood, saluted, and walked out into the scorching afternoon light. Back at camp, Drake met her halfway down the airstrip. They're pulling you. Looks like it. Where to? She shrugged. Doesn't matter. He looked at her rifle case. You keeping it? Her eyes softened slightly. It's the only thing I trust. They stood there in silence for a long time, the desert wind whipping around them. Finally, Drake said, You know, I've served under a lot of shooters. Never seen one listen to silence the way you do. Ashlin smiled faintly. Silence is honest. It doesn't have an agenda. He looked down. You did the right thing. Maybe, she said, but right doesn't always win. That night she couldn't sleep. The air was hot and still, heavy with dust. She walked out beyond the perimeter lights where the desert began, endless, open, free. The stars burned overhead, scattered across a black sky. She sat down on a rock, rifle beside her, and let the quiet wrap around her. Her mind went back to Montana, to her grandfather's shop. She could see it as if she were there. The wooden workbench, the smell of oil and tobacco, the soft rasp of metal files. He used to hum while he worked, something low, tuneless, comforting. She could almost hear him now. One day, you'll learn the difference between precision and peace, he'd said once. Only one of them keeps you alive. She thought she understood then. She realized now she hadn't. A sudden gust of wind brushed across her face, warm, dry, restless. She whispered into it, You still watching me, old man? The wind answered with a swirl of dust that danced once, then vanished. She smiled, small and sad. In that moment, she knew what she had to do. She couldn't stay in the desert, couldn't keep teaching lessons that no one wanted to learn, that humanity mattered more than obedience. The next morning she turned in her orders, her rifle and her rank insignia. No ceremony, no farewell, just a quiet walk across the tarmac and a flight north. When she landed back in the States, the world felt smaller, quieter. She drove west across the plains, through the mountains, all the way back to Montana, back to the ranch, back to the barn that still smelled faintly of her grandfather's oil and walnut wood. Inside, dust motes floated through shafts of sunlight. His tools were still there, arranged with the same care he'd taught her. And on the far wall, her rifle's twin, mounted above a small brass plaque, 2,200 meters, June 2014. She stood there for a long time, staring at it. The weight of everything she'd done, and everything she hadn't, settled in her chest like gravity. She whispered, You were right, Grandpa. The wind never lies, but people do. The barn stayed quiet, but somehow she felt answered. Later she walked out to the edge of the property. The field stretched forever, the same way they had when she was a kid. The air was still, calm, the kind of peace that didn't feel earned but offered. She closed her eyes and lifted her face to the wind. For the first time in years, she wasn't holding a rifle. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she needed one. Why did peace feel heavier than combat? Ashlin had thought the quiet would save her. But back in Montana, the silence wasn't soft, it was vast, echoing, endless. The kind of quiet that amplifies thought until even the wind sounds like memory. Days blurred into each other. She rose with the sun, worked the fields, fixed the fences, and cleaned the old rifles in her grandfather's barn. The rhythm should have been enough, but there was something missing in the pattern, like a skipped heartbeat in a familiar song. Sometimes, when the wind picked up through the valley, she'd look east and imagine the desert again. The way the heat shimmered, the way the dust moved like it had a mind of its own. She still listened to it, even here. And sometimes it still answered. The barn became her sanctuary. It was filled with ghosts that didn't ask questions. Her grandfather's bench sat untouched, tools lined up neatly, each one with a story. There was a faint burn mark on the wall from when he'd once dropped a soldering iron and cursed it under his breath. She could still hear him laughing about it years later. Now she laughed too, quietly to no one. She had rebuilt part of his workshop, turning it into a place where she taught long-range shooting. Not to soldiers, not anymore. To ranchers, game wardens, search and rescue volunteers, civilians who just wanted to learn precision and patience. She never talked about her record, never mentioned the 2,200-meter shot. She didn't need to. The people who came to learn from her came for something else entirely. They came because she taught differently. While others talked about speed, she talked about stillness. While others talked about recoil and control, she talked about respect for the rifle, the air, the distance. And sometimes, if someone stayed after class long enough to ask, she talked about trust. Trust is the one thing that doesn't lie at 1,000 yards, she'd say, her voice soft but certain. Either you have it or you don't. At night, she'd sit on the porch, the sky wide and full of stars. The sound of crickets replaced the gunfire that used to live in her dreams. But sometimes, when the wind changed, she still heard echoes, voices over radios, the hum of a scope adjusting, the sound of her grandfather's low, approving laugh. And sometimes, she'd wake before dawn with her heart racing, breath shallow, fingers twitching as if reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. The war didn't live in her anymore, it visited. And it never knocked. It was late autumn when the first letter came. A plain white envelope, no return address, only her name written in careful handwriting. Inside was a short note. "You probably don't remember me, ma'am. I was in your class at Bragg in 2015. You told me to trust what I could see. Last month in northern Syria, that saved my life. I just wanted to say thank you." She read it twice, then set it down. It wasn't the first time a student had reached out, but something about this one, the handwriting, the humility, the quiet tone hit deeper. It reminded her that maybe her best shots weren't fired from a rifle at all. More letters followed. One from a Marine Scout sniper who'd once dismissed her teachings as too poetic. He wrote that after his spotter was hit, he'd used her method, reading mirage lines instead of relying on digital wind calls, and landed a shot that saved an entire patrol. Another from a young woman in the Air Force, who had joined because of the story of the sniper at Bragg who outshot everyone. She'd gone through her own course and had written simply, "Thank you for proving that quiet doesn't mean weak." Ashlin kept the letters in a small wooden box under the bench. She didn't show them to anyone, but on the nights when the wind was loud and her thoughts were louder, she'd open the box, unfold a letter, and let the words steady her breathing. They reminded her that maybe everything she'd carried, every mistake, every silence, every hard edge, had meant something after all. Winter came. Snow covered the ranch in soft silence. Ashlin spent her mornings splitting wood, her afternoons in the barn, and her evenings watching the horizon turn pink and gray. Life became small, manageable. And then one morning her phone rang. It was Drake. She hadn't heard his voice in 2 years. "Merrick," he said, voice rough, familiar. "You still listening to the wind out there?" She smiled faintly, still trying to. There was a pause on the line, the kind that carried news before it spoke. "They're reopening the review on the Fairpoint incident," he said finally. "Command's using it for a case study on engagement judgment. They're reframing it. Turns out that convoy you didn't fire on. You were right." Ashlin went still. She didn't say anything for a long time. Drake filled the silence. "If you'd fired that day, you'd have hit an American recon team. They confirmed it through satellite review." She closed her eyes. The breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding came out in a tremor. "Thought you'd want to know," he said. "Yeah," she whispered, "I did." That night she sat on the porch again. The sky was clear, the stars sharp against the dark. She held a small cup of coffee, steam curling upward like smoke. She thought about the letter in her pocket, the one that had almost ruined her career, the one that now meant something entirely different. She thought about the moment she defied orders, not out of rebellion but instinct, humanity, and how close she'd come to being punished for it. She whispered into the cold, "You were right again, Grandpa. Trust what you can see." The wind stirred, faint but familiar. Days passed, the calm returned. Then another call came, this time from an unfamiliar number. "Staff Sergeant Merrick." The voice was young, nervous. "I'm calling from Fort Bragg. We're putting together a documentary series, stories of instructors who changed the way we think about marksmanship. Your name came up." Ashlin almost laughed. "I don't think I changed anything." "With respect, ma'am," the voice said softly, "you did." She hesitated. "What would you want from me?" "Just your story." Her story. The one she'd lived, not the one people told. The one filled with silence, mistakes, and moments no camera could ever see. She said she'd think about it, then she hung up. That evening, she went back into the barn. The smell of wood and oil wrapped around her like a memory. She sat at her grandfather's bench and looked up at the old rifle mounted on the wall, his rifle, the one that had started everything. She reached up and touched the cold metal. Dust brushed off under her fingers. "You'd probably tell me not to do it," she whispered. "Not to talk, just to let the wind carry it." Silence. Then faintly, the old wooden roof creaked as a gust slipped through the gaps. It almost sounded like laughter. She smiled. "Yeah," she said softly, "maybe it's time." The next morning, she recorded her answer. She didn't send a polished email. She sent a voice message. Her tone was quiet, calm, the kind of steady that came from years of learning when to pull a trigger and when not to. "If you want my story," she said, "tell it the way it happened. Don't dress it up. Don't call it heroism. Call it what it was. A human being trying to do the right thing in a world that measures right by orders. Tell them about the wind, about what it taught me, that it doesn't care who you are, it only moves. And sometimes, if you listen long enough, it tells you when to stop fighting it." She ended the recording there. For the first time in years, she felt something shift inside her, a kind of lightness that had nothing to do with pride. It was something closer to peace. That night she dreamed. She was back in Montana as a little girl, lying in the grass beside her grandfather, staring at clouds. He pointed to the sky and said, "You see those lines? That's the wind drawing its map. One day you'll learn to follow it." She turned to him in the dream and asked, "Where does it go?" He smiled, "Where it's needed." When she woke, the wind was blowing softly through the open window. She didn't close it. Why did being remembered feel harder than being forgotten? The morning they arrived, the sky was clear, pale blue, stretched across the Montana plains like a sheet of glass. Ashlin had been outside since sunrise, mending a broken section of fence near the north pasture. The air was cold enough to sting, and the grass whispered under her boots. When she heard the tires on gravel, she didn't look up at first, but then a voice called out, "Staff Sergeant Merrick." It wasn't military, too light, too uncertain. She turned. A black SUV idled near the barn. Two people stepped out, a young woman carrying a camera and an older man with the easy, cautious confidence of a producer who'd learned how to handle veterans. Ashlin wiped her hands on her jeans. "You're early." The man smiled. "You said dawn, we figured you meant it." She half smiled. "Most people don't." They shook hands. The young woman introduced herself as Lena, the camerawoman, and the older man as Hale, the documentary lead. They'd come from Fort Bragg's historical division, funded by the Department of Defense's outreach program. Their goal: record oral histories of soldiers whose actions had changed training doctrine. Ashlin wasn't sure how she felt about that. She motioned toward the barn. "You can set up inside, it's warmer there." They followed her in, stepping carefully on the wooden floorboards that creaked under their weight. Hale looked around, eyes wide at the rows of rifles, tools, and brass plaques that filled the walls. He pointed toward one, the familiar one, 2,200 meters, June 2014. "That's the shot, right?" he asked quietly. Ashlin nodded once. "That's the one." Hard to believe something that far could even be hit. She gave him a faint, tired smile. Most of life's hardest shots aren't measured in meters. He smiled at that, the kind of genuine grin that said he understood more than he let on. They set up their cameras while she made coffee. The smell filled the barn, mingling with gun oil and sawdust. When they were ready, Hale adjusted his mic and sat opposite her. "Whenever you're ready," he said softly. Ashlin folded her hands, staring at the floor for a long moment. Then she lifted her head. "People think that story started at Fort Bragg," she said. "It didn't." Hale nodded. "Where did it start?" "In a barn like this one," she said. "Only smaller, with a man who believed the wind could teach you things." As she spoke, her voice changed, softer, reflective, but steady. She told them about her grandfather, the smell of walnut wood, the way he'd made her lie in the dirt for hours watching the grass move, how he'd taught her that a bullet wasn't about force, but patience. She talked about joining the army, about the skepticism, the laughter, the way every range felt like a courtroom. Then she told them about that day in 2014, the range at Fort Bragg, the impossible target, the laughter, the silence that followed her hit. Lena's camera hummed quietly, the lens catching the light through the barn's high window. When she finished describing the moment, Hale didn't speak for a while. Then he asked, "What went through your head when you heard the word hit?" Ashlyn smiled faintly. "Nothing," she said. "Just silence. I think that's when I realized it was never about proving anything. It was about being understood by something that doesn't speak." "The wind," Hale said. She nodded. "It doesn't lie." They filmed all day. She spoke about Afghanistan, not the battles but the waiting, the quiet, the seconds before the trigger pull when the world holds its breath. She spoke about the people she'd trained, the letters she still kept in a box, the shot she didn't take, the one that nearly ended her career but saved others. At one point, Lena stopped filming, tears silently falling down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "It's just, you talk about war like it's alive." Ashlyn smiled gently. "It is. We just forget that it's listening." They broke for lunch, sitting outside under the pale sunlight. Hale asked if she missed it, the uniform, the purpose. Ashlyn thought about that for a long moment. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but not for the reasons you'd think. I miss the clarity. Out there, right and wrong felt sharper. Now everything's quiet and you have to live with what you decided." Hale nodded slowly. "And do you?" She stared out across the fields. "Most days." That evening, as the crew packed up, Lena asked if she could film one last thing, Ashlyn standing by her grandfather's rifle. Ashlyn hesitated. "Why?" "It's how I want to end the story," Lena said softly. "You and the rifle, past and present, legacy." Ashlyn looked at the plaque again. 2,200 meters, June 2014. She thought about what that distance had cost her, about how every meter between her and that target had been another inch of loneliness she'd carried since. Still, she nodded. The camera rolled. She stood beside the rifle, one hand on the stock, eyes distant. Lena whispered, "You can say something if you want." Ashlyn thought for a long time. Then she spoke quietly, almost like a prayer. "Sometimes people think precision is about control," she said. "It's not. It's about surrender. The wind decides where the bullet goes. All you do is trust it, and sometimes, if you're lucky, it trusts you back." The camera light blinked red, then faded out. After they left, the barn felt emptier than usual. Ashlin stood in the doorway as the SUV disappeared down the long gravel road. The sky had turned gold, the air still. She could still hear the echo of her own words in the quiet. She thought about how strange it was to spend half a life trying not to be seen, and the other half realizing maybe that's what people needed to see most, the silence between everything. Inside, she turned off the lights and sat at her grandfather's workbench. The letters were still in their box, the smell of coffee still in the air. She took one of the letters out, the first one she'd ever received, and read it again. "You told me to trust what I could see. Last month that saved my life." She folded it carefully and set it beside the rifle. The wind outside picked up soft, steady, endless. She whispered, "You were right, Grandpa. It wasn't about the shot, it never was." The next morning, the phone rang again. It was Hale. His voice carried that same calm respect. "We just finished reviewing the footage," he said. "Ashlin, it's powerful, but there's one thing I wanted to ask before we finalize." "What's that?" "At the end, when you said it's not about control, what did you mean, really?" She smiled. "It means everything I ever tried to control, distance, people, reputation, none of it mattered. The only thing that ever mattered was staying still enough to see the truth." Hale was quiet for a moment. "That's a hell of a line." "It's not a line," she said softly. "It's a lesson." Later that evening, as dusk settled, she went for a walk beyond the property line, past the fields, past the fences, to the ridge that overlooked the valley. The same ridge she'd stood on as a girl with her grandfather. The wind was rising now, cool and steady. She could see the patterns again, invisible, but there if you knew where to look. The grass leaned in directions that told a story older than her family, older than every war she'd ever known. She raised her hand, feeling the current brush across her fingers. It wasn't loud, it wasn't fierce, it was alive. She closed her eyes and whispered, still watching. And for the first time in years, she thought she heard an answer. Not words, just wind. And that was enough. That night she couldn't sleep, but not from restlessness, from peace. The kind that doesn't come from forgetting, but from finally understanding. She sat by the window, moonlight spilling across her desk, and began to write. Not a report, not a confession, just a letter to no one or maybe to everyone. If you ever find yourself doubting what you see, stop. The world is full of noise, orders, data, fear. But there's truth hiding in the quiet. Learn to hear it. Trust it. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. When she finished, she folded the paper and placed it under the old brass casing from her legendary shot. Outside, the wind rose again, whispering through the valley. This time, she didn't listen for meaning. She just let it move through her, the way it always had. Why does the end of a story never feel like an ending? The film premiered 6 months later. Ashlin didn't plan to watch it. She told Hale she wasn't interested in seeing herself turned into a myth. But the night it aired, the quiet of the ranch felt too heavy, and curiosity, or maybe loneliness, pulled her toward the small television in the corner of the barn. She sat on the old wooden stool, the same one her grandfather used when he cleaned rifles. The barn lights were dim. The screen flickered to life. The opening image was familiar, a grainy shot of a desert valley, heat rising off sand, a voice narrating softly. 13 of the best marksmen in the U.S. military missed a shot no one thought possible. And then, a quiet woman stepped forward. Ashlin almost reached to turn it off, but she didn't. The screen shifted to footage of Fort Bragg, soldiers training, rifles firing, flags snapping in the humid air. Then the narrator's tone softened. Her name was Staff Sergeant Ashlin Merrick. She wasn't the loudest in the room. She wasn't the strongest. But when she spoke, the world listened because she had learned to listen first. The film cut to her interview, her face half-lit by the barn's soft light, eyes steady, voice calm. "You don't fight the wind," she said on-screen. "You learn to work with it." The next segment showed her students, men and women from different branches, from different years. Each spoke about what she'd taught them. One said, "She made us see the air." Another said, "She didn't teach shooting, she taught patience." A young woman in uniform, voice trembling slightly, said, "She made me believe that quiet doesn't mean weak, it means ready." Ashlin sat very still. She didn't cry. She just listened to them, to herself, to the echo of her grandfather's lessons reborn in other voices. The final shot showed her standing beside the old rifle, one hand resting on it, wind blowing through the barn door. Her voice played over the image. "Sometimes people think precision is control. It is. It's surrender." The screen faded to black. And then the words appeared. "Dedicated to all who listen when the world tells them to shout." The credits rolled. The barn was silent again. The next day, her phone didn't stop ringing. Messages, emails, letters. Old students, new ones, strangers, people from other countries, other lives. One message read, "I watched your story tonight. My daughter wants to join the military. She said she wants to be the quiet kind of strong. Thank you." Another said, "I was in Afghanistan in 2014. I remember the day you made that shot. We were downrange, didn't know who you were, but we heard the radio call. I've never forgotten it." She read every message, every single one. And that night, for the first time in years, she smiled without the weight of memory behind it. A few weeks later, a truck pulled up the drive. It was Drake. Older now, a few more lines on his face, but still carrying that easy steadiness she'd trusted back in the desert. "Figured I'd see the legend in person," he said, stepping out. She laughed. "If you call me that again, I'll put you to work mending fences." He grinned, "Deal." They sat on the porch as the sun dipped low over the valley. He told her about life after deployment, the teaching, the losses, the little things that had kept him going. At one point, he turned to her and said, "You ever wonder how far that bullet really went?" She raised an eyebrow. 2,200 meters. He shook his head. "No, I mean after it hit." She smiled, slow and knowing. "Farther than either of us will ever see." They sat in silence after that. No need to fill it. The air was enough. Later that night, after he'd left, Ashlin walked back to the barn. The old rifle still hung on the wall, the brass plaque beneath it glinting in the light of her lantern. She stood there for a long time, thinking about everything that had happened since that single pull of a trigger years ago, how one moment could ripple across a lifetime. She reached up, touched the cold metal of the barrel and whispered, "Thank you." She wasn't sure if she meant the rifle, her grandfather, or the wind. Maybe all three. Winter came again. Snow drifted across the fields, soft and slow. The world seemed quieter now, or maybe she had finally learned to hear it differently. She kept teaching. Small classes, smaller lessons. Not about distance or weapons anymore, but about awareness. She started calling her program Stillpant Training. When asked why, she said, "Because every shot, every decision, every life has won, that moment between breath and action where you decide who you really are." People came from everywhere to learn that lesson. Soldiers, firefighters, even athletes. They came expecting tactics. They left understanding silence. One evening, a student, a young man fresh from deployment, lingered after class. He asked, "Ma'am, can I ask you something personal?" She nodded. "How do you stop hearing it?" he asked quietly. "The noise, I mean, the ones that don't go away." Ashlin looked at him for a long time, seeing herself years ago, the same tired eyes, the same invisible weight. "You don't," she said finally. "You learn to listen differently. You learn which voices are yours and which aren't." He frowned, "And when it's all too loud?" She smiled softly. Then you step into the wind, let it take what it wants, keep what's yours. He nodded, eyes wet. Thank you. After he left, she stood there a while longer, alone in the empty barn. The wind slipped through the door, brushing against her face. She whispered, "Take what's left, old friend." That night she wrote another letter, not to anyone living, but to her grandfather. You were right about everything. The wind taught me more than any war could. It showed me when to stop fighting and when to stand still. You said someday I'd understand the difference between precision and peace. I finally do. Peace isn't the absence of noise. It's the choice to hear it and not let it own you. She folded the letter, slid it into a small wooden box beside the brass casing, and closed the lid. Outside, snowflakes drifted down, soft as breath. Months later, the documentary won an award. She didn't attend the ceremony. Hale called her afterward, his voice full of warmth. "You'd have been proud," he said. "I already am," she replied, "of everyone else." He laughed. "You really are impossible to praise." "Maybe I just don't need it anymore." He paused. "What do you need, Ashlin?" She thought about that for a moment, watching the snow swirl outside. "Nothing," she said finally, "just time." Years passed. The world moved on, new wars, new soldiers, new names. But the story of the quiet sniper from Montana lingered in training manuals, whispered across classrooms, retold in barracks and ranges around the world. They said she could read the wind. They said she could make the impossible look inevitable. But the ones who knew her best said something different. They said she could see the truth before anyone else believed it. One spring morning, long after the cameras and the questions faded, Ashlin walked back up to the ridge overlooking her land. The sun was rising, the wind gentle. She closed her eyes and breathed in. The world was still moving, air, earth, light, all in quiet harmony. She smiled, because now she could finally feel it, that invisible thread running through every moment of her life, connecting every shot, every breath, every decision. It wasn't about war. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about trust. Trust in what can't be seen. Trust in what doesn't speak. Trust in the small, stubborn human heart that keeps showing up anyway. She stood there until the light turned gold, hair brushing in the wind, her shadow stretching long across the grass. Somewhere behind her, the barn door creaked, as if the past itself was exhaling. Ashlin turned once, looking back at everything she'd built, everything she'd lost, everything she'd learned. Then she whispered the only truth that had ever stayed with her. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. The wind carried the words away, across the valley, over the hills, farther perhaps than any bullet ever had. And this time, she didn't need to see where they landed.